There's a nice story that I always tell when I do these, and it's a story of a gentleman called Cliff Young. And it's a great thing. It's like when you haven't been exposed to people or things or stimuli, because there's lots of things that make us believe certain things, right? It can be the people around us, it can be our peers, it can be your friends. Increasingly so is television. Okay? Television is filling everyone's mind with so much crap now about things that you can't do. But there was this man called Cliff Young. He was 61 years old, okay, and he lived in the outback. But Cliff Young, at 61 years old, had a dream. He wanted to run in a long-distance ultramarathon at 61 years of age. And so he went to the pub one night. He just happens to be reading the newspaper, sharing a paper with his friend over a pint, who's the school coach in this little tiny village in the outback. And he turns to his friend and he says, "Look at this advert here." He says, "There's an ultramarathon on." And he says, "An ultramarathon?" He goes, "Well, how's an ultramarathon?" He says, "Well," he says, "it's just you run a long distance." He says, "Well, how far do you have to run?" He says, 544 miles, Sydney to Melbourne. And he says, "I think you're out of your bloody mind, mate." He says, "You're 61 years old." He goes, yeah, but I've always wanted to run long distance running." He says, "Well, why do you think you can do this?" He says, "Well, he says, I work on the farm." He says, "I run around collecting all the animals, so I'm pretty fit." So he says, "If I do it," he says, "will you coach me for a little bit and help me?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "If you want to do this and it means that much to you, I'll come with you and you can do it." So he trained with his friend, running around the school pitch for a few months. And then eventually his friend's got this old high-ace van. He's put a bunk bed in the back of it and everything. So they head off from the outback to Sydney, to run the Sydney to Melbourne Marathon. He gets a chance to sign into this race, and he's initially refused entry because he's 61 years old, and it's actually a sponsored event, so there's all sponsors sponsoring this big event, so it's to make the store look good that's putting this on. So what they really don't want is an old guy doing it, drop dead, but that's not bad for business. So they refused to let him in, but he's very persistent, Cliffy, so he keeps going back and back and back, and he wears them down, and eventually the promoter says, "Okay," he says, "you can do it, but you have to promise me that if you start to feel unwell, or maybe it's more difficult than you imagine, that you'll stop." He says, "If you promise me that," he says, "you can run the race." So Cliffy says, "Yeah, no problem." He says, "Well, I feel well, I'll stop anyway." So he says, "But there's no reason for me to think that's going to be the case." So there are hundreds and hundreds of the world's greatest long-distance runners at this race. They have travelled from America, they've travelled from South America, they've travelled from England, they've travelled from all four corners of the world to run in this race. There are thousands of them, okay? And they're there with their big motorhomes, physiotherapists on board, nutritionists, they've got everything there. And Cliffy has arrived in the back of an old van. His sister came along with a wedge of ham to make sandwiches, and that's the extent of his nutrition. But that's not even the funniest part, because when all of these runners are there at the starting line, Cliffy comes walking up in Wellington boots and galoshes, and one of those hats with the corks hanging down, Australian outback guy. So he rolls up to the start line with that Wellington boots on. And then the gun goes off and everyone starts running except for Cliffy. Cliffy's a bit dazed and he's not really sure of his environment, and he sees them running from some distance, and he eventually starts to go, and there's thousands of people lining the roads to watch them head off. But Cliffy didn't even run. He starts shuffling, barely his feet off the ground like this. His feet are barely coming off the ground. And everyone starts laughing at him. What is this idiot doing with his feet dragging along the ground? I think you know where I'm going to go with the story, don't you? You think I'm going to tell you he finished the race. Is that what you think? Well, that's true. He did finish the race, but it was more than that. At 61 years of age, Cliffy actually won the race. And you can Google this if you like. And what happened was, you see, Cliffy didn't have any limiting beliefs about running. If he had, he wouldn't have shown up to run in the first place. Because he realised you needed a motorhome, a physiotherapist, a nutritionist, and all of these other things, a sponsorship deals for your running clothes, and all of this kind of stuff. He'd have done a quick add up on his pen and paper and realised you needed about £500,000 before he could even think about attempting it. But he didn't have any limiting beliefs because he didn't have a television where he lived. There was only a few people in the pub that kind of got on with their own lives, so he had no people saying him you couldn't do this or whatever, so he just decided that he could do this, and he did. But he won the race. He won the race out of thousands of people because he didn't understand the concept of long-distance running. You see, long-distance runners have to run for 18 hours and sleep 6. Cliffy didn't know you had to sleep, so he just kept on running. And he didn't just beat them, he beat them by a day and a half. At 61 years of age. And when he got to the other side, a reporter couldn't wait to speak to this old guy. Not that that's particularly old, but given that most of these top world runners are around 30 years of age, he's twice the age of his nearest competitor. And this journalist got up to him and he said, look, I can't believe what I've just witnessed. He says, you have to let me interview you. He says, no problem. He says, you can interview me. He says, I just want to know how you did that. He says, because I would have lost my house before I would have bet my money on you. So I just wouldn't have believed you could ever do that for a single second. He says, there must have been a time when you didn't think you could carry on. Cliffy said, well, you know what, there were plenty of times I didn't think I could carry on. And the man said, well, what did you do then? Why didn't you stop? He says, well, what I did in those moments, he said, I used to imagine that I was back at home on the farm and that there was a storm coming and all the animals were out, all the pigs, all the horses were out, and I had to run around and round them up until I got them safely back in the barns because I love the animals. He says that every time I felt the pain that I couldn't go on another second, is that I just used to, in my imagination, I just used to collect all the animals and I wouldn't stop till in my mind I hadn't got them all, so I had to carry on until I got them and put them safe back in the barns. But he touched on something that he didn't realise, because he touched on something called visualisation. Another thing you might call this your imagination. Okay? But visualisation is an extremely powerful tool, because when you see something in your mind, this is one of the best ways to change beliefs, by the way, in medicine mind.